Good evening and welcome to the third, I believe, event here at the forum already. And for those of you who are here for the first time, this is the most prestigious forum at the university. And it often draws, as we have tonight, wonderful participants, speakers. We have a first-class group here. But we want to take a moment as we start for, it's a bit of a surprise, yeah, as you know, the Institute of Politics, which sponsors these forums, is a critically important institution for this university. And we lost our director here in the spring, and there was a real scramble to see if someone could come in and serve temporarily while there was a search on. And the school was, what's that? Okay. The school was extremely fortunate that a friend of Senator Ted Kennedy's, one of his dearest friends who had gone here to Harvard, agreed to come in and give up his, this is a man who was basically in his retirement years. John Culver went here to this university, went back to Iowa, ran for public office, became senator from Iowa, and just an outstanding public servant and a wonderful human being. And there are so many of us here at the Kennedy School who are grateful, John, that you were willing to come. And if I can take just a moment, I'm going to come down and present something. I want to say that in 1953, John Culver was playing fullback for Harvard University's Harvard Hall of Fame. And in 1953, Harvard went down to Yale. Harvard hadn't won in the Yale Bowl since 1940. And Yale was very heavily favored in that game. And John Culver was the man that broke it open. He got the ball in the Yale 34 as a fullback. He went down, he broke into the open, and he went down and scored a touchdown, and Harvard went on to win 13-0. And it was a big victory. People remember ever since. And as a memento for that occasion, your friends, your many, many friends at the Kennedy School would like to have something here on the walls of the Kennedy School and the IOP, and here it is.
Oh my Lord!
Yeah, here it is.
Oh
There it is. This is. That's good. Those of you who would like to go back and read it, the Harvard Crimson that reported on that game, and a really wonderful early sample of his writing. The reporter was David Halberstam. And you can find in the files a wonderful story about that game and John Culver. So I recommend that to you. So with that done, thank you again. The inscription says to John Culver, with thanks for your many touchdowns for Harvard, from your army of friends at the Kennedy School. And we mean it sincerely. Thank you. Thank you. Now, you have the programs already with the bios of our three speakers, and rather than going down through the entire bios, I'll ask you to read that. But you do know that R.A. Fleischer was the worked for George W. Bush, first in his campaign, and then for 2 years in the White House, and knows the slings and arrows of journalism and the White House as well as anybody I know. In fact, all three of these folks do. But Ari went on to write a book about that time called Taking Heat, which was a New York Times bestseller. And the rest of his bio is there, but you should know now he's taken on he's formed his own company, and he's asked for consulting on public affairs from a number of major sports teams. And he's deeply involved in sports, professional sports. That's a tale for another time. But Ari, thank you for being here. Did you say you saw some protesters? They must have been about something else.
Oh, it was just 2004 all over again.
I understand. Camille Johnston is here, fresh, just 2 weeks ago, from working in the White House. as a special assistant to the president and the communications director for the First Lady. And she, before that, had worked for a variety of people like Bob Reich and in various cabinet departments in Washington. I think it's fair to say that Michelle Obama's launch as First Lady was one of the most successful in contemporary history. And Camille had a great deal to do with that. She's now working with Siemens, a major German corporation, international corporation, has a large role there. And on her left is Dee Dee Myers, whom I had the privilege of working with back in the early Clinton years. Dee Dee was the first woman in the history of the country to become press secretary at the White House. It was not an easy go in the beginning, but as she can relate. But I think it's fair to say, there's a tension between the press and the press secretary. And at first, the press was ahead. I think when Dee Dee left, Dee Dee was well ahead. And I think that the score was reversed. And she has written a best-selling book in the New York Times, Why Women Should Rule the World. She is married to Todd Purdom, who used to be with the New York Times and is now a major figure with Vanity Fair, and just wrote a piece that was hair-raising about what it's like in Washington today, and I want to get to that as we can, because we've assigned that article in our politics course here this fall, because we thought it was really worth people having a chance to read that. And I should say that Dee Dee's accompanied here by her sister, Betsy Myers, who spent many a year, was a mid-career student here and went on to run the alumni program and then became the second executive director of the Center for Public Leadership. And I was privileged, and I really did find out why the Myers sisters run the world. But anyway, thank all three of you for coming. Why don't we start, let's see, it's hard to know. I think we ought to start and work our way up chronologically, because Dee Dee, you were the first of the three, I think, to be in a position there at the White House. How did you get there, and what did you find? I eventually want to come to talking about how has it changed today, but let's talk about what it was like in your day. What were the critical challenges of being press secretary in the White House, coming in there? You hadn't spent a lot of time in Washington. You must have just thought, oh my God, what did I get myself into?
I think each of us will tell our little story of how we ended up there. And one of the things that I think is interesting is that there is no single career path to land in the White House. And for me, I came up through campaigns. In 1983, in 1984, Ronald Reagan was running for re-election. I was just out of college, and at the wise old age of 21, I decided he didn't deserve a second term, and so I went to work for the other guy, Walter Mondale. And we lost 49 states, but in the process of that campaign, I didn't realize we were losing until the last weekend, because there's no believer like a young believer, but in the process of that campaign, I figured that I realized you could make a living working on campaigns, something that I had never considered, never done until then, and loved. So I went from the Mondale campaign to the office of Los Angeles Mayor Tom Bradley, who was a wonderful person, a major mentor to me and a huge influence on my life, and he ran for governor of California in '86, and he lost in a landslide. So I went to work for Michael Dukakis. God bless him. And that didn't work out so well. So I went to work for Dianne Feinstein, who was running for governor of California in 1990, and that's the only statewide election Dianne Feinstein has ever lost without my help. She's been elected to the United States Senate 4 times. So anyway, and then I went to work on a mayor's race in San Francisco, and I got a call from an old friend and mentor of mine, Mickey Cantor, who said, I'd met Bill Clinton a couple times, said, Bill Clinton's getting ready to run for president. You want to interview for the job as press secretary? And I did, and my friends thought I was crazy. I've already worked on every losing campaign in America. Why go work on another one? I mean, no one thought the governor of Arkansas was going to beat George H.W. Bush, who was at about 70% in the polls in the wake of the Gulf War. But I knew a little bit about Bill Clinton, and I liked what he was saying, and I thought he was saying something Democrats needed to talk about. So I joined his campaign, and improbably, he was elected, and I found myself as White House press secretary at 31 And not only was I one of the youngest, I was the first woman. And being young and female in Washington, as Camille can attest, is not always a winning combo. And then throw in that I was from California, where people thought, all the fruits and nuts roll to the West Coast, as I heard so many times. So it was, it was kind of the trifecta of how not to go to Washington. I hadn't been there. I was young, I was female, and there was this new president. We didn't have a deep bench because Democrats had been out of executive power for all but 4 of the previous 24 years. So, yeah, it was shaky in the beginning. It's how we ended up with David in the spring of 1993. But for me, the challenges were getting to know Washington, getting to know a White House press corps, which had some of the alumni from the '92 campaign, but many of them were institutional figures in Washington who knew much more about how that place worked than I did. And then was the breadth of information. And there was also the pace, which we thought was moving along pretty good back in the day. We had cell phones that were the size of like tennis ball cans, and there was no email. There were pagers. We thought we were very high tech because we would use these pagers to contact the White House press corps about developments, and we would say, page out, call us. That was our high tech system. But that said, we didn't have the tools for managing the flow of information either, and so the pace. But the only cable television station was CNN, and CNBC was brand new, and it was sort of, what is this, and is it important, and do we need to put people out to talk about business during the day? Is anyone watching it? So the challenges were, the technological challenges were very different. The political, and we'll get into this, certainly technology has changed dramatically the way politics has worked, but so have a lot of other things. But I think, sort of learning Washington, dealing with the flow of information, the pace of events, and the growing partisanship. Clinton was a polarizing figure, particularly in the first couple of years. In some of the themes I see in the Obama, first couple of years are similar. There was just a refusal on behalf of certain people in the country to accept him as the president, and he had only won 43% of the vote. So we never had a solid majority. At least Barack Obama came with 53% of the vote, which was helpful. So sort of dealing, and then we of course made some tactical errors in our first weeks and months. I think it's a really good idea to start the presidency with gays in the military. That worked out really well. And there were a few other missteps. It was really good to get in a big controversy about the Attorney General on day 2 and have to fire our first nominee. So, we got off to a good start, which made things easy for this new administration with a lot of young faces. But anyway, so we worked our way through it. Things got better, but the first 2 years were pretty tumultuous, as David and I can tell endless war stories. So that's how I got there, and that's what the broad outlines of the first.
How did you find a tension sometimes between, well, you always found a tension between what the reporters wanted to know and what people inside wanted to tell them?
Right.
How much tension did you find, or pressure did you find coming from within inside to tell them less than the full story, to omit certain critical facts, to bend the story a certain way? Did you feel like under internal pressure on things like that?
Well, yeah, I think there's always, that's a pressure that I think everyone who deals with media feels, and I think you guys will speak to that as well, that you're serving two masters. On the one side, you have your boss, the president, and the administration and its goals. And on the other side, you have the press and its the pressure that it puts on you, but also a commitment to its need to know. I mean, the press, for all of its foibles and dysfunction, is a stand-in for the American public, and it's not only a means for communicating the president's views, but I believed, and I think you guys to a certain degree, less now maybe after having been White House press secretary, that it is an important ballast against institutional overreach. That's the only check we have on power. There's no free society without a free press, and so you do feel like you live in that space, in that tension. And there were times when people inside wanted you to be able to stop a controversy by telling less than everything. I never, ever was pressured to say something that wasn't true. I think no press secretary would knowingly do that who wanted to keep working. Your coin of the realm is your credibility. Once that's shot, you can't be helpful to the president or anybody else, or ever work in a town like Washington again. So you have to be very careful to tell the truth, but that doesn't mean you have to say everything you know. And so there's a tension between how much do we have to say, and a lot of times there's a tension between what's the best way to end the controversy. Is it by saying this much and no more, and trying to stop the press by just refusing to give additional information, or is it by telling everything you know, getting it all out, as David often counseled wisely, and then once everything's out, they can't keep coming back at you with the drip, drip, drip of additional information and new stories about old issues every single day. So that's a tension I think that we lived with a lot. On a more personal note, I think the hardest thing for me to deal with in my particular circumstances were the personal stories. And I mean this particularly for me was Whitewater. Because the one thing I knew is I didn't know all the details of what had happened in Arkansas 10 or 15 years ago with characters who had names like Red Bone. You know, you knew you didn't have all the facts, and that was a very difficult territory. And you knew that Mrs. Clinton in particular always knew more than you did, and that you could only get yourself into trouble. And you wanted to protect the president, but I didn't feel like I could always do it as well because the stories were complicated and no one had their handle on the facts.
So in effect, you had to play reporter yourself inside the White House.
And I described that job, Dave, I'm glad you said that, because I often describe the job of being a press secretary as being a reporter. People always say, well, who told you what to say every day? Well, no one tells you what to say. I mean, a lot of people will tell you what they think you should say, and there are, particularly on foreign policy issues, there are kind of approved talking points about, you know, diplomatic processes are very carefully modulated, and so, you know, there's certain things you can say about a negotiation that's ongoing. On the other hand, when you're dealing with, for us it was the health care bill, which was in progress, and there were big questions at stake throughout. You know, we always said we were for universal health care. What did that mean? Was that 96%, 96.5%? If 2% were uncovered, was that universal? And people had different opinions about how we should deal with that, what the policy answer should be, and so you had to be very careful as you were going out to talk to the media about where we were in the process of putting together policy. And this is just one example because it happened across the board. And the one thing you didn't want to do was to paint the president into a corner or to make it look like we were changing our position. So you had to try to learn as much as you could, know as much as you could, and then figure out to the best you could where the story was going to go so that you didn't put the president in a position of having to contradict himself or the administration of having to contradict itself. And I found that to be a big challenge as well, sort of trying to see around the corner all the time and strategically answer questions so that you didn't trap yourself. And I got caught with that more than once. The one instance in particular, it's David and I worked together on this, so he remembers it as well as I do. It's kind of a long story. I apologize for going on and on, but it's, I think, indicative of what happens to press secretaries. If you remember, President H.W. Bush went to Kuwait on the anniversary of the Gulf War liberation of Kuwait, and there was an assassination attempt on his life. A big bomb had been planted on the side of the road, and mercifully the president wasn't killed, but immediately, this was during President Clinton's tenure, we said, you know, we were going to get to the bottom of it, and the FBI was investigating, and when they reached the conclusion about who had been behind the assassination attempt, we would take action. And so this went on for weeks where the press would periodically ask me, what's the status of the investigation into the assassination attempt? And I would say the same thing. FBI's looking into it. Once they've got an answer, they'll come back to us, and the president will make a decision. So one day, I got the guidance from the NSC, the National Security Council, saying nothing's changed. That's still the guidance. So I went out there, was asked about it. I gave the same answer. The president, we're waiting for the FBI's report. Well, unbeknownst to me, the FBI had already given the information to the president. And unbeknownst to me, the president had decided that in response, we would bomb the Defense Intelligence Agency in Baghdad. And unbeknownst to me, Tomahawk missiles were about to be fired from ships in the Gulf. And so I had given misinformation. And then David came and said, you need to be back here this afternoon. It was by now, and then the next day was a Saturday. I still didn't know it was happening. He said, you need to come in this afternoon. Something big is brewing. I told the press they could go home because he didn't really say something big was brewing. He said, you need to be back here. And it turned out I told the press they could go home. There was nothing going on. And they had a once-in-a-lifetime press day at the Baltimore Orioles game. So they were all on their way to the Orioles game. I got back and found out that not only had I given the press the wrong guidance on Friday, I put a lid, which meant there would be no more news coming out of the White House on Saturday. We are about to announce the president's first national security response that included firing weapons at a civilian building in a foreign country. And so that was really hard for me to unravel. That was a real blow to my credibility. And it was a very painful experience for me. And I had to stand there in front of the media the following Monday and answer questions about my own credibility. That was by far the worst professional experience of my time at the White House. But you can see, I survived. I'm still here. But that's a good example of, and in hindsight, what I should have done was said, The president will receive a report from the FBI, and until we have an announcement, I have no further guidance. Instead of setting up a ticking clock, where I said the president's going to get the report, it'll be, they'll forward the report to him, and then he'll decide what to do. I set up a situation where I was expected to report on the president receiving the report, as opposed to the president taking action in response to the report. So I learned a very painful lesson.
Wow. I thank you for telling me that story. I could tell the rest of that story, but I think I better leave it for now. But there's an interesting and actually humorous part of that. But Ari,
I'd like to know the humorous part.
before we leave tonight, I will tell the humorous part. I'll tell you another piece of it. But Ari, it really, you've been waiting patiently. Please tell us about your journey into 1600 Pennsylvania.
Well, I guess my career working for a lot of Republicans started out because I was raised as a liberal Democrat. My parents to this day are very proud Democrats who, when I left the White House in the summer of 2003, my mother did an interview at our local hometown paper in the suburb of New York, and they asked her what she thought about my working for George Bush, leaving the White House. She said she hoped this was a phase I was going through and that I would grow out of it. My father also chimed in, and he said to the same little paper that if his son was going to rebel, it's better I became a Republican than a drug dealer, but not by much. So I arrived at Middlebury College in Vermont in 1978, a proud liberal Democrat. Thanks to Jimmy Carter, I graduated 4 years later, a proud conservative Democrat. And then because of Ronald Reagan, I fell for Ronald Reagan, and especially his sense of peace through strength and what Ronald Reagan meant to America, and especially a time of patriotism. I grew up in an era where I never heard anybody cheer for our country. And that U.S.-Soviet hockey game in 1980, where crowds chanted, USA, USA. I was 19, 20 years old, and it just struck me. You can cheer for this country, because in the post-Vietnam, post-Watergate era, nobody did. We didn't even fly the American flag on the campus at Middlebury College. And I remember writing to the president of Middlebury, asking, why don't we fly the American flag on this campus? And I kind of got branded by the administration as being a rebel rouser. Why do you even have to ask a divisive question like that? Was the tone that came down. This was the reality of life in the late 70s, especially on college campuses around the Northeast. And so I graduated, and then had no clue what I was going to do for a living, moved back to Westchester County in New York. And a friend of mine had a brother from Middlebury who was managing a congressional campaign, and they needed a press secretary. So they said, would you like to interview to be press secretary? So just as an immediate college graduate, I applied for the job, I got it, which tells you how little you need to know to be a press secretary. And I just fell in love with the nexus of communications, politics, and policy. There was something so exciting to me about every day advocating on behalf of somebody in a cause that I believed in. We lost that race, it was 1982. I moved to Washington, D.C., and got a job as a press secretary for a New York congressman, and my career on Capitol Hill took off. I worked for nothing but Republicans at that point. I changed parties, and I worked as a press secretary to 3 congressmen, 1 senator. And then in 1999, I became Elizabeth Dole's communications director when she ran for president. And when she dropped out of the campaign, Governor Bush asked me to move to Austin, Texas to become spokesman for his presidential campaign. And
Did somebody inside recommend to you who knew you? Or how did you get the call by
Bush?
By Bush.
Karen Hughes. Karen and I used to debate each other on those little boxes on TV when Crossfire was a TV show. So Karen Hughes, who was Bush's counselor, chief communications aide, Karen and I, even though we were rivals, I was for Dole, she was for Bush, we just had a great relationship. We hit it off. We debated civilly on those shows. And then I actually ran...
This is on television.
On television?
Yeah.
Because Karen and I didn't know each other personally.
Right.
I knew a lot of people on the Bush campaign. And then I ran into Governor Bush at the August straw poll in Iowa in 1999. And he came up to me behind stage. I'd never met him. And he said to me, I really like the way you handle yourself. You have a nice manner about how you do your job. And I just remember, wow, that's really nice. This guy's probably going to be the nominee. What a nice thing for him to say. And then when Dole dropped out, I actually thought I was done. I'd been in politics for 16 years. I thought when I moved to Washington, it was going to be 1 or 2, and I was going to move back home. 16 years later, I thought, I'm done. I'm going to go into a corporation somewhere or do something else. And then when he asked me to move to Texas, I just said to myself, I've got one left in me, and I really like this candidate. I really like George W. Bush. So I packed my bags, moved to Texas, and I just loved doing it.
You were there then 2 years. You were up through, you were there, you left in 2002?
No, July of 2003,
July 2003.
on Bastille Day,
And when was the invasion of Iraq?
in March of 2003.
So you went through the first 3 months of Iraq.
Things were great when I was there.
Was it mission accomplished time yet?
Yeah, and if you want to get into that, there's a fascinating story about that, why it was. But yeah, I was on
Yeah,
board
no,
with Abraham
I think
Lincoln.
people would be curious.
What happened with that? And
This is I think everybody knows the carrier, the big sign with the president, when he flew out to the carrier, and it was sort of a Top Gun moment.
Right. President landed on the deck of the Abraham Lincoln in a flight suit, and when he gave a speech that night, high above him on the ship, the Abraham Lincoln, was the big banner, "Mission Accomplished." And that later became the symbol of all that went wrong, the message of all that went wrong as Iraq spiraled out of control and the violence grew so much worse. We never found weapons of mass destruction. That came back to haunt us. Here's the backstory about why that took place. The war with Iraq began on March 14th or 15th. The statue of Saddam in Baghdad fell on April 6th. That's how quickly the war was successfully prosecuted. From April 6 on, I was repeatedly asked in the press briefing room, when is the president going to declare the war over? Why hasn't he done it already? And as weeks went by, despite all the fighting that was still going on in the Sunni Triangle and in Fallujah, the press was banging, starting to say, is the president only keeping this war going for political purposes? That way he can have the upper hand and leverage over the Democrats. So there was a real sense that this war is over. Why won't you declare it over, at least in the press corps? Well, the president went down on May 2nd to declare an end to major combat operations, which were the words that he used. But our advance team flew out to meet the Abraham Lincoln somewhere between Hawaii and San Diego, where the ship was coming in. Abraham Lincoln was the longest deployed ship in the history of the United States Navy. Never since has a ship been out from its home port and at sea for as long. And the sailors aboard the ship came to our advance people, and they said, we'd like to have a banner, we'd like to have some type of commendation of our service to the country. Would it be all right if we hung a banner that said "Mission Accomplished"? Our advance people thought it was a great idea and a fitting tribute to the sailors aboard and the Marines aboard the Abraham Lincoln. So the banner went up out of respect to the sailors who asked for it. In the president's speech that night, his words were, major combat operations are over, strikingly similar to what President Obama declared. And then he added, Iraq remains a dangerous place. There are still areas where it will take a long time before they become peaceful. And that part of his speech was always forgotten. And indeed, that summer in Baghdad, and my brother was a civilian in Baghdad, working with our military, you could go out to downtown cafes in downtown Baghdad in the summer of 2003. It was in the fall of 2003 that it started to spiral out of control. And then when the Sunnis and the Shias started to fight with each other, the country almost blew up in civil war. My point being, on May 2nd, it sure felt to America as if combat was over and the mission was accomplished. In retrospect, it surely didn't hold up, and that became the issue.
But I'm confused about one point now. Was the sign of the mission accomplished there because the sailors wanted it, or were you also trying to send a message
No,
about the war itself?
The sailors asked for it, and our advance staff agreed to it, thinking it's an appropriate message to put up.
About the sailors?
About the sailors, but also the feeling was the war had major
Right.
combat operations are over.
Okay,
we
so it was
toppled the
also,
regime.
so it was also then,
There was a feeling it was
it
consistent
was
with the
another
message.
intention.
There was a feeling it was consistent with the
Right.
message, yes.
So you take responsibility. I
Oh,
mean,
there's
the
no question,
administration takes
it was put up by us, yes.
Yeah, okay. Because it got hung around people's neck. It is an interesting, it is, these are so hard sometimes because just to go back to another H.W. Bush, when he promised in his campaign for president that he would not raise taxes, read my lips. And when you get into these real declarations and you take a firm, hard stand and reality changes underneath you.
Well, and sadly, President Obama, after he said that that combat is over and we
Yeah.
brought our troops home, even though we
Right.
have 50,000 troops there, including 5,000 special forces, all of whom are combat troops.
Right.
2 American servicemen were killed the following week in Iraq.
Right, right. Well, this is summer, this was recovery summer. He also had a label out there. They went for it and called it recovery summer, and it's been thrown back in their faces.
And the
It's
real
been-
challenge
they've
for
been mocked for it.
politicians is when you make a declarative statement, can it hold up over time?
Right. Wow. And how tough was it for you in there?
It was only tough on days that ended in Y. The job of the press secretary is the most wonderful, intellectually stimulating, best job I will ever hold, and exactly at the same time, the most punishing, grinding, most pressure-filled job I could ever hold. And that's why I loved it so much. I thrived in that environment, I loved it, and then when it was over, I was so happy that I said I'm leaving it. And that's the paradox of
Do you
being the
miss
press secretary.
Do you-
No. In fact, the next day I was on a treadmill jogging in the middle of the afternoon, something I hadn't done in years, and the little TV came on and my successor's briefing was on, and my first reaction was, ooh, I wouldn't want to be in that guy's shoes. No, it's the type of thing when you're ready to go and you know your time has come and you know you're burning out, nothing feels better than to resume a normal life.
Wow.
And I was able to do that.
Thank you. Camille, tell us about your journey and sort of bring us into the current age.
Well, I feel really confident that Mrs. Obama declaring "let's move" is not going to create any major controversy. Obesity is a pretty safe topic. I grew up in Los Angeles, from a large family of Catholic liberal Democrats, and moved to Washington, D.C. in 1991. And moved in with a group of girls on Capitol Hill who were working for presidential campaigns, one of whom was working for Senator Harkin. And I took a job as an intern in the office there, which eventually led me to President Clinton's campaign, where I worked in Iowa for the general election in '92. And from there, I took several positions in the administration as the press secretary for Secretary Riley at Education, and then for Bob Reich at Labor. And then I went back out to Iowa in 1995 to do the caucuses for the '96 campaign, where we got 99.9% of the vote, and I spent an awful winter in Iowa for no good reason. Yes, exactly, taking one for the team. Then I went to Chicago and followed Senator Dole around doing rapid response until the convention in Chicago and then the general election. After '96, I stayed in Chicago and worked for CBS, WBBM-TV as their communications director. When I got a phone call in 1999 asking if I wanted to come back to the White House and work for Mrs. Gore as her communications director. And I happily said yes. And my first day on the job, I was worried about what kind of luggage do you pack for Air Force Two and how big a suitcase can you bring. And it was Columbine. It was my first day on the job. And every day after that changed. That Friday, Mrs. Gore said to me that she wanted to tell everybody that she'd been treated for depression. And at the time, her husband hadn't declared his candidacy yet, but he was certainly about to. And as you know, in politics and in Washington, announcements like that can kind of go either way. And it was truly one of the most rewarding experiences of my professional career for that announcement and the way that it was handled and treated, to have gone for so well for her and then so well for the country, because it really did lead to the activities around getting parity in mental health care in the insurance industry. And it also changed how Mrs. Gore campaigned for those 2 years, because it was very much about something that she believed in as much as things that her husband believed in, which oftentimes when you work for the spouse, we did 3 cities a day, 5 days a week for almost 2 years, from '99 to the end of the 2000 election. And it's very hard to leave young children at home to go out there and work that hard when it's not something that's necessarily about you. And to have mental health and to have people as her top issue, and then to have people out there who came up to her on every rope line and said things like, because of you, or my husband, my wife, my child, someone has gotten help, or they lost the battle, but I appreciate all that you've done to eradicate the stigma about getting help. And the 2000 campaign was heartbreaking in every way in the end. The recount was a brutal experience, and I vowed not to go back to Washington at the end of it. No interest in returning to Washington. I moved to New York and worked in publishing. I moved back to Los Angeles and worked for the Dodgers, which is truthfully the most combative relationship I've had with the media.
I've heard the only thing meaner than political politics is sports politics.
You know, I think one of the things that I found, and one of the reasons is those jobs are changing so much for the reporters who have them, that they're really grasping to keep hold of something. When I was there were 5 reporters that traveled with the Dodgers. Now there's 1. The news business itself has changed so dramatically that the people who covered sports, many of them were older, many of them had devoted their careers to this, and they were losing out to bloggers or someone who could do it for half as much or for little to no pay because they just liked it. And you were getting the same type of reporting out of a blogger as you were getting out of a Times. So the sports pages, many of them have just bought up blogging websites and turned to them to be their beat reporters. But I was living in LA. I had not been part of the Obama campaign, short of writing a check and being a big fan. I didn't really play an active role in the campaign at all. And I got a phone call out of the blue after the election asking me if I wanted to apply to be Mrs. Obama's communications director. And I thought, why not? And I was offered the job.
Did you know somebody there inside?
The first person I worked for in Washington, D.C., Lorraine Voles, had recommended me for this job. So it goes to show you that those relationships that you build in Washington all those years ago really do stay with you. I think all of us would attest to that the people that we worked with from the beginning are probably some of our closest friends. And Lorraine had recommended me. And I met with Mrs. Obama in Chicago. And I went to Washington to meet with Robert Gibbs and Ellen Moran. And I was offered the job 2 weeks later and packed up and moved out from LA 2 weeks after that. And it really was one of those experiences where you can't imagine having a second shot at the job. Because when we left in 2000, had we served, I would have had a similar job for Tipper. And I really never expected to have that opportunity come around again. And to be offered that job, and then to really feel like you know what you do with it. I walked into that job really knowing that I kind of knew what I was going to do. And I wouldn't say that everything plays out the way that I expected, but for not having been part of the campaign, not being from Chicago, not being an old friend, not actually falling into a lot of the categories that people often fall into when you work for someone in that capacity, it really has been fantastic. And I think one of the things that Mrs. Obama did so naturally was capture people's imagination about what this administration meant for America and Americans, but also for people around the world. And I think that's one of the first things that we learned when she traveled over to London and spoke at that girls' school over there, is the impact that not just having her husband elected, but she herself as the first African-American First Lady.
Yeah, it seems so natural, the way and yet there must be a lot of planning.
You know what, there's a lot of planning because Mrs. Obama is a really disciplined person. She herself, she wants a disciplined life. You know, she wants to have a normal life for her husband and her children. And oftentimes it does fall to the spouse to create that environment, to make sure that dinners are important, that soccer games are on the schedule, that there's family time and all of those things. And that for her is very much her first priority. And I think it's evident. I think people feel that way about them. I think they see that their family is of supreme importance to them and to her. And so yes, there's a disciplined approach to it, but I think Mrs. Obama is uniquely herself. The one thing I feel like I can brag about them a little bit, since I wasn't the reason that they were elected, they held themselves to very high standards throughout their lives. This wasn't something that Mrs. Obama had to change in order to become a First Lady. she really is the person that 10 years ago, it's the exact same person, those same high standards. And so I've never been in a position of having to figure out what to do next or what to say next, because A, she's very engaged in the process, and B, it's going to inherently be true to her, authentic to her.
Interesting. I want to ask Dee Dee and Ari to reflect on how things have changed, and perhaps you could respond to that to see about whether the outside impressions are accurate. What's been very stunning to me, Todd's piece in Vanity Fair painted a picture of a much meaner Washington. It's relentless. The pace is relentless now because of technology. There is a sense of people being under siege. I talked to a friend yesterday who had been talking to someone very high up in the administration who had been in previous Democratic administrations, who said it's much, much tougher to govern today than it was. And one of the things that this person felt was that the blogosphere had made it much more complicated, that every day if you woke up in his part of the world, you were under assault from somebody or some groups of people in the blogosphere. And he said, you just have to deal with it. It's not just questions. The press corps asking you questions, hard questions, and now having 24/7 kind of needs. But the blogosphere puts people under assault, and people get in. And so a lot of people don't want to read it, and they have their staff look at what's out there and then tell them things selectively. But that everybody gets cranky in the system. And everybody feels, whether you're on Capitol Hill or you're on press corps or you're whatever, everybody feels a little bit under siege. And that this has made it it's a much, much tougher world, and things are going much faster, and there are many more balls in the air to try to juggle, just substantively, policy terms. It's partly because of the nature of what this president inherited. It's also partly because he has a very ambitious schedule. It's also because the world has become a lot more complex. Just everything is much more complex. So it sounds like a really tough environment. But Dee Dee, I'm curious, you were there when Todd was writing and reporting on all of this, and what's your impression of this now? How do you size it up today versus what seemed like a very short time ago?
Yeah, I mean, back when I was in the White House, there was something called a news cycle. You'd wake up in the morning. It just sounds so quaint now, doesn't it? Yeah. That the news would start in the morning with the morning shows, and it would go through, really the end of the news cycle was the network news broadcast followed by deadlines for the daily papers. And when the daily papers went to bed, the news cycle was over for the day. Something big could happen the wires would call you at 10 o'clock at night, but for the most part, on a normal day, if there ever is such a thing as a normal day, the news cycle would end and it would start again the next day. Now there is no news cycle. There's just this continuous stream. Some guy in his PJs, sitting at his laptop, can wrench the news cycle, take the headlines away from the president, and dominate the news. Some crazy pastor with a Bic lighter in a messianic complex down in Florida can really kidnap the news cycle for a week. And that was simply not true 15 years ago. So Harry Reid can have a Twitter exchange with Lady Gaga, who wears dresses made out of meat. And that's dominating. I mean, is there anybody here who didn't hear that Lady Gaga and Harry Reid, the majority leader of the Senate, had a Twitter exchange about gays in the military? I mean, it's absurd. And so,
It also focuses on the trivial.
It is completely trivializing. It's ADD, right? I mean, it's complete. Everybody in politics has developed an attention deficit disorder, and it exacerbates partisan tensions, which are, I think, exacerbated by a couple other things, including what we're about to see writ large, which is partisan gerrymandering of congressional districts across the country. And so I think that becomes a very volatile stew. There's the influence of money in politics. The lobbyists really do, on some level, run Washington. It's depressing when you start to get into the numbers and see that, I think one healthcare company spent more on health reform than the collective staff of every congressional office on the Hill. And so you realize how outgunned even people who with the best of intentions are in this environment. So you have this volatile mix of media that is now measured in minutes and not days, money that's sort of swamped the Capitol, and partisanship that's completely poisoned the dialogue. So I think it's a very, very tough place to govern. Now, that said, I mean, one of the things that, the president has been able to get big things done in Congress. It's just the ability of his opponents to seize the message and to turn the country, I mean, I don't want, I mean, that's my partisan view, turn the country against some important accomplishments. And I'm sure Ari has a different view about why these things have gone south, but there's no question that part of it has been they lost control of the message. And there was never a thoughtful debate about the substance of health care. I think it was really a partisan, and on both sides, and the Democrats deserve some blame for it as do the Republicans, but it became a partisan football and not a thoughtful debate.
All right.
You know, I agree on the technology makes things so much faster and tougher, but I don't agree on the substance. I think our American democracy has always been a rough and tumble democracy, you know, and it's better than every other system in the world. In 1800, it was said that in the election between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, that no one could cross the street without caning somebody else if they weren't for the candidate of either Jefferson, supporter of Jefferson, or supporter of Adams. And in the early days of the Republic, people were said regularly to be bastards, illegitimate, their family ties were questioned, bigamists, that was what was charged against Andrew Jackson. And the worst thing you could say about anybody at the beginning of our republic was that they were a monarchist, which was said against Alexander Hamilton. So we've always exercised strong voices, it's just the technology back then was really slow. Now, the technology moves at light speed, but I'm a believer that if your principles are good, and if you're willing to govern well, and if you can attract support for your ideas, you can still get your ideas passed in the United States Congress. And under my experience when George Bush was there, you know, so much of this is tainted because Iraq went so wrong and the second term went so badly, we didn't find the weapons of mass destruction. And people don't remember this about what it was to govern that. But we had a Democrat Congress in much of the Bush administration. And Congress switched even at the very beginning. It was a 50-50 Senate at the first election in 2000. Bush's tax cuts were supported by 1/4 of all the Democrats in the Senate, overwhelmingly bipartisan. The education reform that Bush put through was done with Teddy Kennedy, overwhelmingly bipartisan. The Patriot Act after the attack of September 11th, overwhelmingly bipartisan. And then even when a Democrat Congress came along on several important national security matters, the creation of military commissions to try terrorists, overwhelmingly bipartisan, passed by a Democratic Congress, signed by President Bush. And even something that was that Bush was criticized for at the end of his administration, warrantless wiretaps. That actually was approved by a Democratic Congress, signed by President Bush, allowing warrantless wiretaps in accordance with the law. Overwhelmingly bipartisan. So when I look at where we are today, and this is the flip side of what Dee Dee was saying, I think if Barack Obama, when he first became president, Congress didn't pass any of its spending bills when Bush's last year. They figured, we'll save them, hopefully Obama will win and we can do it there and have our priorities signed into law. And that had a lot of pork and a lot of spending in it. I think if Barack Obama's first act as president had been to veto that appropriation bill because it was too big and had too much pork, he would own Washington, D.C. today. He would have commanded the center and people would look at him very differently. Instead, he made the decision, because he had almost Watergate-sized majorities in the Congress, to turn a lot of the legislation over to Speaker Pelosi and Leader Reid. And as a result, on health care reform, for example, 34 Democrats voted against it. Despite having a majority of more than 40 in the House, it passed by only 7 votes. Same thing on cap and trade. 34 Democrats voted against cap and trade, equal number. No Republicans voted for either of those initiatives. And I contrast that to the ability, if you are able to find the sweet spot in America's center and govern either center left or center right, but you've got to get that center. And the biggest regret I had in the Bush years where we failed legislatively, and it shows how hard it can be to govern from the center, was immigration reform, where conservative Republicans, no way were they ever going to be for it because they called it an amnesty. Liberal Democrats were no way ever going to be for it, especially organized labor, because it would have brought in labor that could have competed with organized labor. But the center, we tried to build a center, and there was no center to be built. But I do think it can be done, and it's going to vary from issue to issue.
Well, there are those of us who might disagree with that, but I'm going to move on from that, because Camille, as you've heard these descriptions of where we are today, how do they ring with you?
Well, the White House is a 24-hour news cycle at this point. I don't think that there's at any point in time when there's not some staffer over in the West Wing who is on their BlackBerry, and I think that's one of the reasons politics is often a young person's game, because they actually really love it too. And that is the nature of the beast these days. But I think a lot of the tone with the media is reflective of the lack of bipartisanship in Washington. I mean, I know that Mrs. Gore was very close with a number of Republican Senate spouses, that they routinely worked on projects together, that there was a camaraderie there because your children were in the same schools, and that you saw each other at church, and that you hung out on the weekends. And that part of it I don't think really exists anymore. And I think it's kind of a chicken and the egg thing there with the media and how they cover the White House and other politicians, because you certainly have people who are willing to throw the other side over. It's already been declared that next Congress, if we lose, will be filled with investigations of this administration. That is the tone in Washington, and nobody's more looking forward to that than the media who get to cover it. That is their bread and butter, is the controversy. And so I think it's both. I don't think it's just the media getting nasty.
Okay. We're going to go to the floor. Those of you who want to ask questions, we're going to go for the floor about 20 minutes now. I do want to, I promised I would tell the end of the tomahawk story. So Dee Dee, I'm glad you told the story about, this is a story about President Bush Sr. going to Kuwait, assassination attempt. President Clinton promises, vows retaliation once we find out who did it. Found out that it was I think it was the intelligence agency of Saddam Hussein. And this is where I entered the picture. So I had just arrived at the White House, and the intelligence came in that in fact it had been Saddam Hussein's intelligence operation. He had the headquarters for the intelligence operation were out southwest of Baghdad, and President Clinton asked some of us to come in and talk about what he should do. And it was a fairly small circle. Dee Dee should have been there. This is an area where I think we fell down too often, as I found out later. But there was a fairly small circle, the Joint Chief, head of the Joint Chief, Secretary of Defense, NSC advisor, and I happened to be among them. And President Clinton was faced with the choice of how, it was for his first military action as president, and he had never in his life pulled a button or pushed a button that killed anybody. And he knew that this was going to be involved. So he was very anxious to live up to his vow to retaliate, but he wanted to minimize the loss of civilian life. He thought that was really important. So the plan was struck very privately to fire these Tomahawk missiles on Saturday afternoon off an American warship in the Persian Gulf. That they would be fired around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. They would strike around 5 o'clock in the afternoon East Coast time. It would be late at night, Saturday night in Baghdad on a Saturday night, so almost nobody would be there. There'd be a fairly empty facility. We would demolish the facility but take very few lives. And then the president would then, after we'd ascertained that we'd had a successful strike, the president was going to go on national television to report the mission. And I was designated to be the person to call the networks and tell them or something, or make sure everything happened, which is fine. Well, it turns out we didn't have satellite overheads going over it right at that time to figure out whether we'd struck this intelligence headquarters. So we literally, this is how quaint it was. This is how much it was the old days. The decision was made that we would fire at 3, they would hit at 5, East Coast time, and at 6 o'clock, a few of us in the West Wing would tune into CNN and see that we had successfully struck this facility, call the president, and then call the networks, and he was going to go on an hour later. So the missile, this was the plan. Literally, I'm telling you, this is the plan. So, the missiles went off successfully, everything went so at 6 o'clock, I dutifully turned on my TV set, as did a few others. No report from CNN. No report out of Baghdad. It gets to be about 6:30, 6:45. The president calls me and says, "So, what happened?" Mr. President, we haven't heard him from CNN. He's a little testy. And about 15 minutes later, he calls up, and you can hear he's really getting frustrated. And 15 minutes later, he shows up in the Oval Office, just beet red, angry, points at me and says, God damn it, you told me we know, and so forth. So where is this, and what's going on? I said, Mr. President, I'm sorry, but we haven't got anything. We don't know. We haven't heard yet. And he said, well, can't you do something about it? And I said, well, Tom Johnson, who runs CNN and down in Atlanta, happened to be a friend of mine. Let me call him. He said, yeah, do that. So I got the White House operator. We fished Tom out of some restaurant down in Atlanta. And I said, Tom, have you heard anything out of Baghdad? And he said, well, no, David, actually, we don't have any reporters there right now. I said, you don't? And he said, no, we pulled them out, but we've heard something might be going down. And so we've got some people on the way. And there's some people going in. I said, well, where are they? And he said, they're in Beirut. And I said, well, how soon can they be in Baghdad? And he said, I think they can be there by tomorrow afternoon. I said, that ain't going to hack it. You sure you haven't heard anything out of Baghdad? And he said, well, now that you really pressed me on it, we do have some nationals working there, some foreign nationals who work for us. And one of the relatives from a foreign national called and said there have been some huge explosions down in the southwest of the city, and there's a great big fires going on out there. I said, damn, I think we got it. So I went running in, and Tony Lake was there, and I said, Mr. President, I think we ought to go with this. I think you ought to go ahead and make a report to the country. This has happened. I didn't know what Dee Dee was going through. I didn't know she was going through all this terrible thing. And so he agreed, and Tony looked at him and said, Mr. President, I think you can tell the country we're relatively sure we hit the target. And so we called, and just about 5 minutes before President went on the air, we got some overheads to confirm that we indeed had hit the targets. But that's how much life has changed. In the life of drones, you never have that at all. And isn't that amazing? It was one of those old stories, if a tree falls in the forest and nobody hears it, did it make a sound? And sort of, if something happens somewhere in the world, and one of the television people don't cover it, did it happen? You're not sure anymore. So anyway, life has changed.
The guy in the parking lot would just take a picture with his cell phone, and it would instantly be
right.
Ricochet around the world.
Yeah, exactly.
Or tweet it.
Exactly. But that's the other half of that story, and you must find that bizarre.
Well, I think I knew most of that, at the time, but it was bizarre. I mean, that was the crack Clinton team. No, we were actually good.
Yeah. Okay. Please identify yourself. One question per customer. Joe Nye rules, and every question ends with a question mark. Please.
Yes, my name is Mohammed Hanif Javeri, MPAID. I had a question for Ari Fleischer. Was very inspired to hear your story about how you changed political allegiances. As the last remaining Muslim Republican in the United States, I have a question. What recommendation would you have for the many students who are undergoing a change in political ideology in this school, who are going through this educational process? How should they rebuild their social political capital? And what would you say to those people who are building networks in those political parties that may even be hostile to their very presence in it?
Well, it's a pleasure to meet you. I hope you can clone yourself. And I should have added it. I think I am also the only person in the history of the state of Vermont to enter it a liberal and leave it a conservative. But what I love about political life in America is you can take whatever stands you want and be safe doing it. And I'm reminded, my mother's an immigrant to this country, and she came here to flee World War II and the Holocaust. And I have very few relatives left in my family on my mother's side because they didn't come here. She did. She's free. I'm free. We're free. And that is the story of our country. And so what I love about it is, and I tell young people all the time, it doesn't matter what journey you take. If you believe in a political cause, go out there and advocate for it. Dive in and dive in deep. And the politics will sort itself out. You'll find your way as you get older to what you really believe, and chances are you lock in on it. Certainly people will change their opinions as they get older as well, but I think the journey when you're young is when it's particularly important, because that's when people do start to set it in stone more than anywhere else. So I just encourage you, if that's what you believe in, you should absolutely pursue it. And frankly, a Muslim Republican, you've got a niche that makes you interesting to people too. And I think people want to hear your story and hear why. So you actually have a bigger microphone than you probably think.
Thank you, please.
Huh? Oh, yes. Hi, thank you. I'm Hasina Sherjan, MPA from Afghanistan. And I have a question for Mr. Fletcher. Sort of a related question, but I want to know what was that one specific thing that happened that you changed party? And what was it about George W. Bush that you liked so much that made you go to Texas and work?
What it really was with Ronald Reagan was, as I said earlier, peace through strength. The issue that meant the most to me was foreign policy and defense. And the big debate in the early 1980s was the Soviet Union had installed nuclear missiles, intermediate range nuclear missiles into Eastern Europe aimed at the West. And my party, my Democrat Party, advocated a nuclear freeze. The logic being we have enough missiles already to counteract the Soviets. Why do we need any more? We can blow each other up many times over. And I remember thinking to myself, yeah, but if you allow somebody else to get away with behavior like that, you're only going to encourage more bad behavior. And if you thought George Bush was unpopular, when Reagan went to Europe, Western Europe, there were protests of 500,000 people in the streets of Germany against Ronald Reagan because of this missile decision. He made the decision, and NATO backed him, to counter-deploy, so the Soviets got the message. You want to get into this business, there'll be an arms race, and you'll lose it, we'll win it. And I believed in that. And I thought, my family having fled, and I had a little bit of family left behind who lived under communism, and I knew they didn't want to be there. I thought, we need to stand up to the Soviets, and I was so proud that Ronald Reagan was doing it. So that was the singular issue for me, was military and foreign policy. And I've always been that way. Those are my most important issues still today. Frankly, on a lot of the social issues, I did not change my old views. These I did. But with Bush, by that point, the economic issues, defense, and the military issues were my bread and butter. That's what I believed. I believe and still do in limited government, smaller government, reduced spending, lessening the role of Washington. I think any time the government takes $1 away from any citizen in the form of taxes, it reduces our freedom by $1. And it should only be done in consensus if that citizen agrees. So I'm, on those issues, a small government conservative and a foreign policy hawk. That's why I believe in George Bush.
Thank you.
Please.
My name is Ben Bolger with the Graduate School of Design at Harvard, and many years ago I was an intern for the White House press office under Mike McCurry. My question is that recently it seems like late night television, especially The Daily Show, Colbert, and those types of shows are influencing the way young people get information. Now obviously, as you are typically used to dealing with members of the press and responding to legitimate journalism, but occasionally there are stories that are misreported that may warrant correction or engagement with late night television. My question is, how do you deal with narratives that emerge from satire that impact a president's ability to actually govern? When do you intervene, and when do you just let it blow over?
Anybody want to take that?
I'll just carefully. That's how you do it. I mean, the risk is once you jump into the satirical shows, they roast you and keep you there. And so it's always a case-by-case judgment when you have to do it. But I also point out it's really nothing new. I remember when Bill Clinton, when he was running for president against former President Bush, played a saxophone on, what was it, Leno? Arsenio Hall, which is a kind of a famous moment. And those side shows have long attracted the interest of the American people, and politicians go where the American people go.
I would add to that, I think that Jon Stewart often makes the joke that he's a fake anchor, right, on a fake news show. But you have to go pretty deep into his reporting to find a mistake.
Right.
I mean, he's a very careful reporter. He's actually quite serious journalist in his own way, and then he uses the facts to satirize everyone on both sides, particularly Republicans, because there's so much material. But I think that, I think Ari's right. You have to be pretty careful. But I think you want to I think the reason that young people are going there is because they do find a lot of the things that are happening in Washington absurd, and the posturing is absurd, and the partisan fighting is absurd, and the lack of results that people feel good about is absurd. And so they go to somebody that reflects their sense that this whole culture has gotten absurd. I think politicians should pay attention for a couple of reasons. One, because those storylines, there's truth in that satire, and if they're being satirized in a particular way, you know, it's worth asking, is there, there's going to be a kernel of truth there. Is it a damaging kernel, or is it, you know, Bill Clinton eating French fries off people's plates at McDonald's? That's kind of funny. It's not really damaging on a policy level,
But how
right?
would you-
but other things can be.
What about, but there are these urban myths that are sort of created. What about the fact that, you know, 25% of Americans think Barack Obama's not an American? I mean, you know, how do you combat that?
But I don't think they got that from the satirical shows.
Yeah, they didn't, but they
No,
got that.
but they got that from the
other places.
blogosphere.
Yeah.
They got it from blogosphere, and
Right.
they got it from some, they got cable.
Well, I'm with
contributed that.
Dee Dee. I think a lot of the satire is actually born from truth, and I think that we probably have more fact-checking with regular news organizations than we do with the daily shows or anything like that. People come to those shows often for entertainment, and then politicians go to them because that's where the audience is. If you look at the number of people watching those shows, you really do have an opportunity to get a message across there to an audience that is tough to reach. It's the same reason you do The View. It's the reason that you go on Letterman, I mean, all of them. It's because that's where the audience is at the moment. But I would say I certainly did more fact-checking with mainstream media than I've ever had to do with a satirical show.
Please.
Hi, my name is Matt Shiraki. I'm an MPP2 here at the Kennedy School. This question is about message development in the White House, and particularly the role of principals like you. For example, in the structure of the White House, you have press secretaries, you have a counselor, the speechwriter, the chief of staff, all these different principals who have their hand in crafting the message. And I'm curious to know the dynamics behind the scenes of how these different folks interact, and obviously there's disagreements, and perhaps more importantly, how the president deals with each of the different inputs and ideas, and how overall this becomes public to the American people.
Great question. As press secretary, my definition of long-term was get me through today. My focus was just on today's news cycle, whatever the problem is today, explaining it to the press today, and then do it again tomorrow. So I can never think long-term. There are other people, the communications director and the counselor to the president, whose job is to say, all right, what initiative we roll out 3 months from now when it's fall, and how are we going to back it up the next month? And they would be the planners and the big thinkers, and then I would just deal with the current controversy. And so it's a pretty good division of labor, and it's a real necessary one. I don't think I could have thought long-term if I wanted to. You're just too busy putting out fires and dealing with all the reporters.
But I think there's too much of that, and I think the Clinton White House, we got into too much of trying to win the news cycle at the expense of longer-term goals. And so I do think there's a tension there, there's a division of labor, but I think that you know, in the early months of the Obama administration, one of the things I admired about them was that they didn't tend to do that as much as we had done in the first couple of years, just always trying to win the news cycle. And sometimes the president was willing to say, all right, we'll lose the news cycle today in service of a longer goal. You know, over the months, I'm not sure, I don't think that's the reason things haven't worked out, but I do admire that discipline in President Obama, and I think it's important. I agree with Ari, you know, when you're drinking out of a fire hose all day, every day, it's hard to kind of try to think of, you know, whether the truck has gas in it or something. But if you don't think longer term, and sometimes be willing to lose the news cycle, I think that can cause a lot of trouble and a lot of short-term thinking that's, you know, counterproductive.
Camille, you've worked the communications director, you've worked in that job, and were very successful with Mrs. Obama. But to go to Dee Dee's point, there is a sense that the Obama team on the other side of the house, the president's team, has lost control of the message.
Well, what I can speak to on that is there are two very separate processes, the day-to-day and the long-term planning, and both of them occur every day. There's a morning meeting with Robert Gibbs with all of the press secretaries, and then there's the meeting immediately following that with Dan Pfeiffer and all of the communications people. And most of them don't, I mean, you interact on a daily basis, but you do have a very separate piece. You know, I think it's about the incoming. The long-term planning is a luxury on the West Wing side of things. And so it is done on an entirely separate track. Do I think that they have lost the message?
We're off the record. You can.
Yeah. Connie Chung, just between us.
Yeah.
I really I don't see that. I see what I guess I think about that is that there's so much going on. You can have an impact on certain things. I think they regained their footing. I think August was a good planning month for them. I think he came out swinging. I think the trajectory between here and the midterms, you'll see him back in fighting mode. And I think that they're gaining some traction there.
Interesting. We're going to do a sort of quick semi-round here, and then we're going to wrap up, please.
Yes, my name is Francisco Marquez. I'm an MPP. My first year, I'm from Venezuela. This might be a specific question, but I didn't know if I had another opportunity. So I don't know if, you lived through a lot of crises. I don't know if you recall April 11th, 2002, with the coup d'etat of Chavez.
Oh, I remember.
Yeah. So my question to you is very interesting for me that the U.S. was one of the few countries that sort of, I wouldn't say legitimized, but didn't openly, not recognize the new civilian government. And my question to you was, what was the discussion at the White House at that time? Who were you talking to in the opposition at that moment, if you remember, like maybe like a factor or a name? Because it's very interesting, the specific reaction that Bush had.
Yeah, that was a very difficult case, and it involved whiplash. Because from a pure principle and policy and ideological point of view, there was a lot of celebrating that Chavez was overthrown. But he wasn't overthrown. I mean, it was if you want to look at it from a democratic, small d point of view, it was illegitimate overthrowing of a man we all viewed as a despot. So what do you do when you say a bad guy has been gotten rid of for the wrong reasons in the wrong way? So our initial reaction was actually the guidance that I got from the National Security Council. Made reference, was basically politely said, goodbye, we're glad he's gone. I recognized we had a problem, and I winged it actually at the podium, and I added, in accordance with the democratic process. I added that because that's the benefit of being press secretary. You start to think like a reporter, and you can recognize the incoming before you get it, and you better preempt it in a case like that. So I started to draw it back a little bit, and then the coup got reversed a couple days later, and a lot of the Western, the hemispheric nations side with Chavez, even if they weren't for him because of the process, because it was illegitimate throwing him out of power. So it was a tricky one for us. For ideological reasons, we wanted him gone, but for democratic reasons, it couldn't be done that way.
Please.
Hi, I'm Lisa King. I'm a mid-career MPA student, and I have a question again on the point of control and crafting of the message. During Bush's second term, there was a lot of noise about the president and the press secretary taking control of the message to the point that what questions would be taken and from whom in the press corps was being tightly managed. And I actually was, my first time at the White House was in the fall of 2004, and there was a lot of grumbling going on amongst members of the press corps. And I actually sat and talked with Helen Thomas, and we know where she sat on that side of the issue. But so I'm just wondering, like, exactly how realistic is that? How much of that really goes on? And especially during that time, especially around questions about Iraq.
Well,
I mean, none of you were in charge at that time, but if you could speak to that.
Number one, the press corps will always grumble. No matter what, there's going to be that tension where they won't be satisfied until there's Oval Office camp, and they can watch everything 24/7 because they have a right to know. And the government says, sometimes you have a right to know, so there's a clash. But that's one of the urban myths of the Bush years. What happened was I prepared a seating chart for the president, as many of my predecessors do, where reporters are going to sit at a news conference. And because he doesn't like the, Mr. President, Mr. President, and people, whoever had the loudest voice getting called on, we had an order in which he was going to call on reporters. End of story. I would have loved if there were reporters like I said, here's your question, and they would, oh yes, we'll ask that one. I would have loved, it doesn't work that way, it never worked that way, the press will never allow it to work that way, and nobody I ever know would ever try to make it work that way. The press would cover your attempt.
How often
you'd
should
end
the
up
president
with
hold a big press conference with a daytime or evening? How often is it, going back to Didi's point originally about accountability? What do you think, Didi?
I think periodically, and I think it should be driven by events. You know, in the first months of his administration, President Obama had several news conferences, all of which were covered by all the networks live during prime time. There were 4 or 5 of them. In the Clinton years, we couldn't get our press conferences covered prime time live, and we had a lot of trouble with that. And so I think, you know, it hasn't always been equally distributed in terms of the network's approach. But I think they're useful periodically. I think they're less useful than they used to be, and I also think they're a huge opportunity for mistakes. I think one of the biggest mistakes the president has made was the incident right here in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And when he was asked about the Professor Gates's incident in his home, and he answered it ad lib, it caused a controversy that lasted a week. He gave an off-the-cuff response. And so there are opportunities for the president to talk to the American people. There are also potential places where mistakes can be made. And so, speaking as a White House press secretary, I'm not sure the trade-off is always worth it. So I don't think you should do them weekly. And I also don't think they become that revealing if you do them all the time. There's a certain theater that takes over, like it does in the briefing room, that can be theatrical but not very productive. The real goal isn't to have an honest conversation about important issues. It's to make news. And the president's goal sometimes is to only make the news that he wants to make, and I don't think that's particularly illuminating for the American people on more than an occasional basis.
You know, it's just a fact of life that from a communications point of view, the rules are different for people at the White House. You cannot say things that normal people would say, that a senator or a congressman would say, without it really coming back to bite you sometimes. And I think the case where Robert Gibbs gave an accurate answer to a reporter about, yes, it's mathematically possible that Republicans can take the House. Because he was the White House press secretary, he could not say that. He needed to punt, he needed to dance, he needed to say, well, it's a hypothetical and I can't answer that. He caused so much pain for his team by giving an honest answer. So when you're at the White House, you reach a point where you say to yourself, my job is to duck and to dodge because there's so much focus and so much scrutiny. If I say what I'm thinking, I will not have helped anybody except the press to have a juicy field day. And so that's why people talk as diplomats or out of caution or political speak. It is the reality of life at the White House. And Robert saw that day.
I got a signal from Noelia, who really runs the show here at Harvard. And one last question. You got the last question. Okay. This is Noelia over here.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you. My name is Sheng Ai from China. I have a very specific question about communication strategies. So during a press conference, normally how do you respond to the questions from the journalists when you cannot offer further inside information? So do you have any very special communication strategies?
Well, I think one of the things that you do, and certainly for presidential press conferences, is you prepare really thoroughly in advance, and you have you start with a briefing book where you put down every potential question that the president might get, and then you draft an answer, and then you go through, particularly in the first press conferences, you go through a sort of a murder board session where you work through the answers. And so when you get that question, that you're pretty good at predicting what the questions are going to be. It's rare. It's pretty rare that you get a big surprise. You work through an answer that sounds responsive but maybe isn't, and there's, you have everything you say has to be true, but you don't have to say everything you know. And that's that's sort of a little bit of an art that you get practiced at in politics, whether you're the press secretary or the candidate or the first lady or anybody else, exactly for the reason that Ari just said.
You know, and after September 11th, my briefings were on live on the networks. Al Jazeera was covering my briefings. And a reporter asked me to confirm whether or not the United States moved F-15 fighter aircraft to Pakistan. A reporter asked me to confirm before any shots were fired whether the United States had special forces on the ground in Afghanistan, because the newspaper reported we did. And on live TV. And what I do when I'm asked a question that there's no way I'm ever going to answer is I try to explain why I wouldn't. And so I said on TV, I said, you have a right to ask anything you want to ask. Sometimes I have a responsibility not to answer. And I left it at that. So there's reasons sometimes, good reasons, that serve the country's interest not to answer questions. You have to try to give an explanation for why. If another instance, and this is going to be true in the Obama administration, it's forever going to be true so long as there are terrorists. When we would capture a bad guy abroad, our initial reaction was never to let anybody find out. And so there was one case where a particularly notorious terrorist, al-Libi, was captured in Yemen. And it leaked. And it was very unfortunate it leaked. So reporters were asking me to confirm a press report whether we had indeed captured this guy who was really notorious. And I told the press, I'm just not going to answer your question. And they said, it's in the news, people are reporting it. Your job as the press secretary is just confirm it so we don't make a mistake. If it's not true, we won't report it. If it's true, just tell us on background and acknowledge it. Well, here's why the government keeps secrets sometimes. We wanted his cell phone to ring again. We wanted him to get emails on his laptop. We wanted his satellite phone to ring. Because if people knew he was captured, everybody he's working with goes silent. If they still think he's working, we can capture more people and trace more leads. So there are legitimate reasons sometimes that the government does things that people initially say, why on earth aren't you more transparent and open? And that was the case in terror. And I think domestic issues are different. You try to be more open. National security is always different.
And at the end of the day, Ari, when all the files are open, will we have greater confidence that in fact the administration was being straightforward about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq?
Oh, there's no question. I think that's already incontrovertibly proven. Everybody said there was weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Bill
But it's
Clinton
like,
said it,
but
Al
it's
Gore
like,
said it, the CIA
it's like,
said it.
it's like the
The
idea.
decision to go to war is an
But-
arguable issue.
but a lot of-
Whether he had it
I don't
was
think
never in
everybody
doubt.
said there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. We were basing
Of
it
course.
on reports.
No, biological and chemical weapons. Everybody said he had biological and chemical weapons. Hillary Clinton said it in her floor speech, voting for the authorization to go to war. The CIO told your administration and told my administration unequivocally, he has biological, he has chemical. There was never any fudge in what the CIA told us.
But I think it was the potential for nuclear weapons that is very much in question, Ari.
And George Bush never said he had nuclear. The question, I've always come back to
No,
biological
but the
and chemical.
smoking
That's what
gun
he
would
said.
be, we don't want the smoking gun to be a mushroom cloud kind of language was pretty persuasive to a lot of people.
And I think there's no question, over time, when we found this out, Saddam was still working to acquire. We didn't say he had. We said we don't ever want him to get.
As you can see. I do want to thank one other person here from the Institute who helped put this together, Noelia, who is the press secretary for Laura Bush. And you should know that. And she very humbly was not part of this panel, but we want to thank you for. And so let me, on behalf of the Institute of Politics and Senator Culver and his team, thank these three. You know, it is certainly true. I'm sure that many of you, whatever you believe, have disagreements with some of the things that you may have heard tonight. But what I hope you will agree is the old Teddy Roosevelt notion that people who are willing to get in the arena deserve respect for their willingness to serve, to take the hits, to stand up for what they believe, even though you may disagree with it. In a robust democracy, there are going to be times when some people have to take, you know, the arrows, but they do it because they think it's right and they want to serve. And it's, you know, and Teddy Roosevelt's point was that the people get it and in the arena are going to get dirty, but you know, they really serve the larger purpose of the society. So we thank all three of you for your service and for coming here. Thank you.
Well done.
Thank you.